in the Old Testament from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God.
These verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too.
Did Jesus claim to be God? Yes, he did. And I'm sure many of you have some verses going through your heads right now. However, I'm convinced that the primary way Jesus claimed to be God, and that his followers claimed he's God, gets overlooked by most Christians and non-Christians because we've lost touch with first century Jewish culture, and we just tend to not notice things. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Boyarin in his book, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of Jesus Christ, the story of the Jewish Christ. He says, most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century, and even later, can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of the period. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. So the ideas were there, paving the way for Jesus, who embodied them. Now, who is Daniel Boyarin to say that Christian ideas like the Trinity and the incarnation were already present in some form in first century Judaism? Is he a Christian apologist? No, he's a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. He's a Talmud scholar. He points out that a lot of the beliefs we now think of as distinctively Christian actually weren't. The earliest Christian church was embedded in first century Jewish culture, but as Christianity spread, it became dominated by Gentile Christians who tended to lose touch with the Jewish framework. And something was happening within Judaism as well. As Jewish orthodoxy was forming in the second century, the rabbis tended to weed out certain ideas that had once been familiar in Judaism, but which had been adopted by Christians. The rabbis wanted to clearly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and some of the ideas that were present in first century Judaism were soon deemed heretical. So Christians lost touch with the Jewish framework of early Christianity, and Jews abandoned some of the Jewish ideas that became part of Christianity. And the result is that today it's easy for us to miss a few things when we're reading the Bible. Claims that would have been understood by listeners at the time might not be understood by us. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to briefly discuss the forgotten Jewish idea that's most relevant for understanding how Jesus claimed to be God. And then I'll show how this forgotten Jewish idea illuminates various passages in the New Testament. Some of you are familiar with the early Jewish belief in the two powers in heaven. Alan Segal, a Jewish scholar, drew attention to this in his 1977 book, Two Powers in Heaven. And lots of people, especially Christians, have been interested in the topic ever since. Here's the idea in a nutshell. The Old Testament is very clear that there's one true God. But there are numerous passages in the Old Testament where we see two divine figures. I'll give a few quick examples. There are tons of these. Sometimes God seems to be in two different places doing two different things. A common example is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that he's going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see firsthand how bad the people are. So he goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happens? Genesis 19:24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord on earth rained down fire from the Lord out of heaven. This thing reboot every couple minutes. It sounds like there are two lords here. Watch what happens in Zechariah 2. Pay attention or you'll miss it. Come, Zion, escape, you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. Who's speaking? The Lord Almighty. And he says, after the glorious one has sent me, the Lord was sent by the glorious one, against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The Lord Almighty was sent by the Lord Almighty. Next paragraph. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord, Yahweh. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord, Yahweh, will live among them, and they will know that the Lord was sent by the Lord Almighty. So Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh. Yahweh is sent by Yahweh. Plenty of passages like these. Then we've got a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. Whatever you think of when you think about angels, just get rid of that. The angel of the Lord is no ordinary angel, because this angel is somehow the Lord. Angel just means messenger. In Hebrew, it can refer to a human messenger, a spirit messenger, or in this case, the Lord himself. Look at Judges 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down to talk to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Then it switches to, the Lord turned to him. The Lord answered. Then it goes back to the angel of the Lord. Then, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. If you see the Lord in all his glory, you're dead. But if you see the angel of the Lord, who is somehow the Lord, you might survive. One more example of this. Here's Jacob blessing Joseph in Genesis 48. Then he blessed Joseph and said, May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. He, singular. So the God, and the angel are all referring to the same being. The angel is God, but the angel is the messenger of God. This is all over the place in the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God, but there were two powers, two authorities in heaven. If you put all of the passages together, it seems like there's God you can't be around because his presence would destroy you, and God you can be around somehow. There's God you can't be around and God you can be around. The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. If there's one God, why are there two powers in heaven?
David Wood points to the two powers in heaven theory to argue that Jews were already expecting a divine Messiah, but that's misleading. The two powers idea was never mainstream. Scholars like Alan Segal, whom Wood cites, say it was condemned as heresy by rabbinic Judaism by the 2nd century. It was mostly found in apocalyptic fringe sects, like those behind the Book of Enoch, not the dominant Pharisaic tradition Jesus grew up in. Also, Wood relies on Hebrew Bible passages that use metaphor and repetition, a known literary device in ancient Hebrew. For example, Genesis 19:24 saying, "The Lord rained fire from the Lord," is a classic example of Hebrew parallelism, not a claim of dual divine beings. This is widely understood by scholars of Semitic literature, such as Michael Heiser, who notes that while some texts may reflect divine plurality, they don't support a Trinitarian view. Even Daniel Boyarin, who's often misused by apologists, does not say Jesus claimed to be God. He explores how early Christian communities reinterpreted Jewish mystical language to elevate Jesus, but that's post hoc theology, not something Jesus clearly taught. Most critically, there is no direct quote in any gospel where Jesus says, "I am God." That absence is striking if he truly meant to reveal himself as divine in a first-century Jewish context that was strictly monotheistic. So the claim that Jesus clearly declared himself divine relies on reinterpretation, anachronistic readings, and later Christian theology, not on solid historical evidence.
I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily. And that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, or the psalmist is talking about, the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm he says, I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that the people who believed in these two powers was talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you. That all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day past his crucifixion and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship and his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too, one day. If this is a claim to be Yahweh, then, well, lucky us, I suppose.
Alex is absolutely right to point out that when Jesus is accused of claiming to be God in John 10, his response isn't to confirm it. It's to quote Psalm 82, where other beings are called gods metaphorically. This shows Jesus is not identifying as Yahweh, but rather as someone set apart, like those divine agents. Now Christians often treat I and the Father are one as a declaration of divinity, but in John 17, Jesus uses the exact same Greek word hen to say he wants his followers to be one with God in the same way he is. If oneness with God makes Jesus divine, then all believers must be too, which is obviously not Christian theology. Jesus clearly means unity of purpose, not identity of nature. And when he says, the Father lives in me, that isn't divine possession. In John 14, he says the same thing will happen to his followers. You are in me, and I am in you. Again, it's about spiritual unity, not ontology. As Hitchens pointed out again and again, if this were really God in human form, he wouldn't speak in riddles. He wouldn't need theologians and translators 2,000 years later to explain what he supposedly meant. The fact that Jesus never clearly says, I am God, in any gospel, shows that the claim of divinity is a later church invention, not something Jesus ever taught.
I showed that in the first century there was an interesting discussion within Judaism about the two powers in heaven. They had various ways of dealing with this. And we can see why when we read passages like Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So this is God saying to Abraham, take your son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. This is when he starts to do it. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is the angel of the Lord saying, you haven't withheld from me your only son. And it was God who ordered Abraham to do this. So we have situations like this, and I argue that Jesus enters the discussion when they're confused about the two powers in heaven and claims to be one of them. And so there we looked at what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, and what his enemies do. Alex seems to suggest that there could be some sort of angel or something like this, or even a person who's endowed with this kind of divine authority. You got problems with this even here in Genesis. So look at what this said. Then the Lord, Genesis 33, then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you are stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way. Who is accompanying them and guiding them? Well, the angel of the Lord. But here he says, I'm not going with you this time. So this is the Lord speaking. It's not the angel of the Lord, and you say, oh, this is the Lord. This is the Lord speaking. This is the Lord speaking, says, I'm not going up with you now, when it was the angel of the Lord who was accompanying them. So these are the sorts of things you have, and people tried to figure out how to deal with this. And they came up, again, with all sorts of ways, and Jesus entered the picture and claimed to be one of the two powers in heaven. So what Jesus says, we went through 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers. He's the divine Son of the Father, he's the Lord of King David, and he's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we saw how people reacted to him claiming to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. In response, Alex was he quoted Psalm 82, and then Jesus using this passage. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? So Jesus is sent into the world, according to this passage. Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? This is not, and I have no idea how you would ever read the Gospel of John like this, let alone anything else Jesus said. This is not Jesus saying, what? You're misunderstanding. I'm just a regular dude. Again, if this were the only verse in there, maybe because given the rest of what we read in the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels, Jesus is not claiming to be a regular guy. He's using a legal technicality here that they should be aware of. They're saying, hey, here's what you're claiming. You're claiming to be the Son of God. This means you're claiming to be equal to God and so on, and therefore, this is blasphemy. And Jesus' response is, well, really? Well, in the Psalms, God calls people Elohim. Therefore, you can't just say calling someone some divine title is blasphemous and deserves a death sentence. You have to show that that the title is not from God, that it's not true, that it's false. Have you done that? No. Okay, you can't kill me. You can't just say there's a claim and therefore we will kill you over it. So that's a legal technicality. Again, if you're somehow reading this as, see, Jesus is just claiming to be a regular guy, wow. All right. So we have John 17:5. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. Why? Alex quoted John 17 to show that Jesus is just claiming some regular relationship that we can all have with God or something along those lines. What does Jesus say in the same chapter that Alex is quoting? And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding. So what Jesus does, we've looked at it. I think he said he's going to respond to it. So what does Jesus do? He's the judge. He's the final judge of all people, according to him. Again, the Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who's going to sit on his throne in judgment. Jesus said, yeah, that's me. The Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. The people in their graves are going to hear the voice of the Son of God. Now that is very strange if that's how we all are. We're all going to be raised from the dead by the Son of God. If that's him saying, oh, we're all just the same and we can all, you'll be in me and I'll be in you. Very strange way of putting things.
Let's be clear. When Jesus is accused in John 10 of claiming to be God, he doesn't affirm it. He deflects. He quotes Psalm 82, where the term gods refers to human beings, members of a divine council, or even unjust earthly judges, not divine beings equal to Yahweh. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and John J. Collins agree. This psalm uses the term gods in a figurative or functional sense, not literal divinity. If Jesus wanted to confirm he was God, he had every opportunity, but instead, he points to a passage that describes non-divine beings being called gods, and then says, why do you accuse me of blasphemy for saying I'm the Son of God? That's not affirmation, it's distancing. And when he says I and the Father are one, he later uses the same Greek word hen to pray that his disciples will all be one with him and the Father in the same way. If oneness with God means literal divinity, then all believers are divine. That's clearly not the intent. Scholars like James D.G. Dunn and Raymond Brown point out that John's gospel uses metaphorical language, not strict metaphysical definitions. Jesus being in the Father is about spiritual unity and purpose, not substance. In fact, Jesus consistently refers to God as someone other than himself. My Father, the one who sent me, greater than I. That's not how you talk if you're claiming you are that same God.
We heard about the angel of Yahweh and the suggestion that this might indeed just be Jesus. It might be. Look, I don't claim to be the sort of final authority on exegesis here. I'm simply asking you to consider what you think is a more appropriate explanation. I've suggested the divine name-bearing model as opposed to the two powers in heaven. And when I look at passages such as Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, see, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. I just ask which interpretation lends itself more nicely to the passages. David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude. That is far, far from the case, especially in John's Gospel, where Jesus seems to posit himself as something of a model of faith for his disciples. And for what it's worth, this is kind of the image that I get of Jesus reading through the Gospels. What is he supposed to be? Something like an idyllic, faithful servant of God, and certainly in a special position. If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking about Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know. That word grasped there, harpagmon, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it. He's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names. Again, which interpretation lends itself more nicely to these passages? For what it's worth, my favorite interpretation, I was discussing this the other night at dinner with, well, not with David actually, that would be giving too much away, but is this so-called Adamic. James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God. If we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems. Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized. Not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2 that for a time Jesus is made lower than the angels, presumably while he's here on earth. Again, it just reads to me as if at least while on earth, Jesus is certainly not approximating Yahweh, but he's also not just some dude. David mentioned the glory that's given to Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 5, the same chapter that I was using. Yeah. Verse 5, Father, glorify me in the presence that I had with you before the world was created. Just keep reading John chapter 17 and see what Jesus wants to do with that glory. In fact, the very passage that I quoted, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray that all may be one, Father, just as you're in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, blah, blah, blah. Immediately afterwards, so they may be brought into complete unity. Then they will know, I've copied the wrong passage actually. Jesus says that the glory you've given me, I will give to them. In John chapter 17. He says, the glory you've given me, I will give to them, the disciples. We're told in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, that God shares his glory with nobody. And this is sometimes a suggestion that's made is sometimes that because Jesus says, glorify me, God, in John chapter 17, he must be God because God shares his glory with nobody. But people just seem to forget that in the same chapter, Jesus says that he will give the glory that he has been given by the Father to the disciples too. Again, all I'm asking you to consider is however you interpret these verses where Jesus is given glory, Jesus is given the judgment, and bear in mind that Jesus is given all of these things, what he then does with those things, and whether he delegates them to other people. Because if he does, then it's clearly not just something that can be delegated to God himself. Only God judges. Only God can judge, but Jesus says that he will judge. Jesus also promises judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So are the disciples God? Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins.
Alex raises a crucial point here. If Jesus were God, why does the New Testament describe his authority, glory, and name as something given to him, not inherently possessed? Philippians 2 clearly states that because Jesus humbled himself, therefore God exalted him. If he already was God, why does he need to be exalted? The Greek word harpagmon, often translated grasped or seized, reinforces this. Scholars like James Dunn and N.T. Wright explain that it refers to something not already possessed, something that would be taken by force, not by right. Jesus didn't seize equality with God because, by the author's view, he didn't have it in the first place. And when Jesus says in John 17, "The glory you have given me I have given to them," it completely undermines the argument that divine glory proves divinity. According to Isaiah, God shares his glory with no one. Yet Jesus shares it with his disciples. That's not something Yahweh would do. Unless, of course, Jesus is not Yahweh. Even judgment and forgiveness, things supposedly exclusive to God, are given to the disciples in the Gospels. In Matthew 19:28, Jesus promises the 12 will judge the tribes of Israel. Does that make them divine too? Clearly not. So the simplest, most coherent reading is this. Jesus was an exalted, chosen figure, a servant of God, not God himself. If Jesus was God, why does he constantly act as if he isn't? Let us know what you think in the comments. Was Jesus claiming divinity or something else entirely? And if this made you think differently, hit like and subscribe for more clear, honest analysis that digs into the facts behind the faith.